Dark Side of the Rainbow, Chapter 2. To her surprise, Bright was as good as his word. Most boys who looked like him were not promise keepers. After she agreed to let him stay at Rainbow Falls, she didn't see him much at first. The sprites told her he woke up at dawn to catch the biggest waves at Indigo Beach, then spent the late morning and early afternoon doing the kinds of chores no one else wanted to do, cleaning out the resort rooms after families left them in a total state of total wreckage, scrubbing up after a whole bachelorette party drank too much sun fruit liquor and was sick all over the second best reservation only banquet hall, even scooping out Heathcliff's sandbox. And then Bright went surfing again until long after the sunset, paddling out in the amethyst glow of the beach itself. But Polly had plenty of time to keep her busy. There was her daily swim at the Emerald Pool, one of the 7 rainbow pools, followed by her tanning session. There was a sunfruit to snack on and rainbow husks to smoke. Heathcliff always needed brushing, naps needed taking, and the best-looking sprites needed kissing. But whenever she saw Bright in person, she remembered the spark between them, and she knew he remembered it too. He might have come to Rainbow Falls to surf, but he was staying because of her. Most boys just wanted her. Polly got the feeling he needed her. But then one night after Bright had been in Rainbow Falls for a week, or 2, or 3, Polly wasn't the greatest at keeping track of time. She lay tossing and turning in her rainbow hammock, completely unable to sleep. Heathcliff, curled up on a soft patch of vermilion grass below her, was snoring softly. His cardboard horn was crooked. He must have pawed at it at his sleep. Polly grabbed a pale, translucent robe of rainbow silk and her surfboard and slid out of her hammock, careful not to wake Heathcliff, and headed to the direction of Indigo Beach. The full moon was out, and it always was in Rainbow Falls, unless Polly wanted to see the stars, and hanging low and huge in the sky. The sun beaches sparkled in its cool silver light. A soft, balmy breeze rustled the fronts of the dream trees. Here and there, flowers swelled and burst, releasing puffs of sweet-smelling smoke that formed tiny, intricate scenes of other places, real and imagined. The faint sound of bongos and harmonizing voices carried across the island. The sprites were at another late-night jam session, which meant they'd sleep in until noon and the guests would have to fend for themselves for breakfast as usual. Polly didn't think much of people who needed breakfast. Who wanted to get up that early on vacation? The only civilized morning meal, obviously, was brunch. That night was as warm as bath water. Polly took a deep breath of rainbow-scented air and let it out again. Maybe Ozma was right. Everything she needed was here, in the paradise she ruled. Maybe staying at home was the answer after all. Her subjects, such as they were, didn't need much direction, so it's not like she actually had to work when she was ruling. The residents of Rainbow Falls were too happy and carefree to let themselves get into arguments about silly things, or to care about the things people lusted over in the Emerald City. Wealth, knowledge, power. Her people were content to swim in the falls, surf the epic waves, nap in the afternoon sun, and stay permanently blissed out in the rainbow smoke, dazzleberry, cordial, and good music. But some part of Polly wouldn't let her rest. There was more out there, she was sure of it, and she couldn't be content in her own kingdom until she was satisfied. For now, the new boy would have to do. Bright wasn't hard to find. While the other resort employees lived in lean-tos buildings into falling dream tree branches and mats woven of rainbow husks. He's been sleeping out on Indigo Beach ever since he arrived on Rainbow Falls. And tonight, under the light of the moon, he was still surfing. Polly could see him easily silhouetted against the moonlit glazed purple waves. She dropped her board, sank down to the silvery sands, tucking her feet underneath her, and watched for a few minutes. Polly had grown up on these beaches. She learned to swim before she could walk. In all of Rainbow Falls, there was no one who could surf like her. No one who even tried. But Bright, she realized, was good. Really good. Maybe even almost as good as she was. She watched him catch wave after wave, standing easily like Heathcliff, like grace, his muscles rippling in the moonlight. Few of Polly's subjects surfed at Indigo Beach. Besides Polly, it was the wildest of all the beaches in the Rainbow Falls. The waves were huge and intimidating, and although it was impossible to drown in rainbows, it wasn't at all possible to spin out into the dizzying array of color and currents and lose sight of shore. People didn't surf out there because sometimes people didn't come back. For days, months, years, sometimes people didn't come back at all. Bright was fearless. He surfed like someone who didn't care much if he got lost or not. Maybe because he already was, Polly wondered. She could see it in the way he moved. It was the way Polly herself moved, graceful, confident, effortless. Bright surfed like he did, like an equal. Polly wasn't used to equals. She found it distinctively sexy. Polly stood up and dropped her robe into the sand. She grabbed her board and looped toward the indigo surf, diving into an oncoming wave so elegantly she didn't even make a splash. She paddled toward where Bright's dark shadow waited, ducking under each oncoming wave until she was sitting on her board next to him. He didn't seem at all surprised to see her. "It's a good night," he said, his eyes flickering toward her, and lingered. Polly knew she was beautiful. She was a fairy, after all, but even if she hadn't had a few supernatural advantages, impossibly long, thick, glossy hair strung with flecks of rainbow that undulated as if it had a mind of its own, eternal agelessness, heaven-colored eyes, etc. She was muscular from a lifetime of swimming and surfing. Her skin was flawless. Her figure was amazing, and she wasn't wearing any clothes, so she couldn't possibly blame Bright for looking, although some part of her was already a little bored. Did he have to make it so easy? He was no better than the sprites. And then Bright surprised her. "Best out of 3? He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the waves. Polly arched an eyebrow. "You can't beat me." He smiled, still looking at her. Still not looking at her. "Let me be the judge of that." She shrugged. "It's your funeral." He shot her an arrogant grin. "Or yours." "I just don't want you to get lost out there," she said. "Your concern is touching." "I hope you're not in the habit of insulting royalty," she said. "I could throw you in prison, you know." "Does Rainbow Falls even have a prison?" "The sprites love a construction project. Gives them something to do." "You're not going to win." "Maybe I like risk." Polly hid a smile of her own. "What's the prize?" Bright, pretending to look thoughtful. "If I win, when I win, I get to do whatever I want." He looked her in the eye, a gleam in his own. "With you." Polly pretended to consider. "And when I win?" He tossed his head, white blonde ringlets flying. "You get to do whatever you want. With me." "Sounds like a win for you either way," she said. "Oh, I think it's a win for you, too." "You think a lot of yourself." "You would, too, if you knew me better." Despite herself, Polly giggled. "Fine. When I win, I do whatever I want with you, which, in this case, is have the sprites dig an underground hole and throw your innocent ass into it until I decide to be lenient." "You're joking," Bright said. But now he sounded a little less sure of himself. "Fairies never joke." "Then I probably shouldn't lose." "I'm afraid you don't have much of a choice." Polly closed her eyes and hummed under her breath. In an instant the heaving indigo light changed, growing choppier and more ominous. On the horizon a huge wave began to build. "That's cheating," Bright said. "Are you afraid?" He met her eyes again, grinning. Polly's heart gave a little skip. He was really very handsome. Distractingly so. "I'm not afraid of anything. Not even you." "Well," Polly said lightly, "you should definitely be afraid of that wave. I'll let you go first." Without another word, he paddled away from her as the swell bore down on him. A twinge of regret flashed through her. She'd made the task impossible, and if she wiped him out completely, even she couldn't bring him back from the far reaches of the Rainbow Sea, which meant she wouldn't be able to enjoy him later. But on the bright side, no pun intended, if he survived the contest he proposed, he'd think twice about insulting royalty, and if he was lost to her forever, well, handsome as he was, there was always the sprites. They knew better than to give her attitude, and they always did what she wanted. Which, come to think of it, was part of why they bored her. The wave carried Bright forward as it began to crest. It was enormous, 20 or 30 feet high, roaring with power. And strangely enough, he didn't look the least bit worried. In one easy, graceful motion, he stood up on the board. He floated down the massive tunnel of light, brushing his fingers lightly against the surface of the wave. If he had so much as faltered, he'd tumble into the indigo depths, and the likelihood that he'd never come back was almost non-existent. But he didn't falter. Polly was impressed. The wave broke, and for a moment she lost sight of him. But as the rainbow sea flattened out, she spotted him seated jauntily on the board, waving at her. Polly grinned and hummed again. The wave she summoned for herself was even bigger. She'd teach him a thing or two about getting too full of himself. It didn't take long for them to forget the original terms of the contest. They were having too much fun. Polly summoned wave after wave, each one bigger than the last. She even surprised herself by smoothing out a particularly heinous wave so that she could watch him a little longer. He looked back and smiled at her as if he recognized what she'd done. They surfed for hours, until finally, as one of the most impressive waves she called up yet bore down on them, Bright shook his head, laughing. "You win, Princess. That one's more than match for me. After all, I'm human." Polly snapped her fingers, and the wave dissolved into a shower of purple rainbow fragments, glittering softly with their own inner light as they fell harmlessly into the sea. "You did all right," Polly said with a smile. "For a boy." "You're not so bad yourself," Bright said appreciatively. "I do have a slight advantage." "Being a fairy?" "No, silly. Being a girl." This time there was no mistaking the way his gaze lingered in her lithe, curvaceous body. Polly smiled to herself. "Why don't you sleep in my palace tonight?" she said, winking at him. "Is that a command?" She giggled and splashed him. "More like a wish. I don't actually believe in making people do things they don't want to." "In that case," he trailed off suggestively and reached out to trace the line of her cheek with one finger. Her lips were inches apart as they floated on the low, tranquil sea. Their eyes locked. Bright leaned in to kiss her, but Polly turned and dove so neatly she didn't leave a ripple in the indigo light and set out for shore. It was best to keep boys on their toes at all times. She heard Bright laugh behind her, and then a splash, as he followed her. They didn't make it back to the palace, and they didn't sleep until much, much later, but when Polly woke up the next morning, well, early afternoon, technically, but who was counting? She was alone on the beach. She yawned and sat up, rubbing her eyes. Boys are so flaky, especially the human kind. A jagged scrap of rainbow husk covered in sprawling cursive was held down by a hunk of crystal next to her. She pulled it free, reading the loopy, slanted letters. "I'm sorry, I'm not very good at staying in one place at one time. You're the coolest girl I've met in a while. See you again soon. B." Polly rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Maybe she would see him again, maybe she wouldn't. Either way, that had been some truly excellent surfing.